Would you like to know how to make this neat epoxy table? If you want to learn how, stay tuned. So this is my work table I built to do epoxy projects on. And I decided if I'm going to have an epoxy work table, might as well make the top out of epoxy. So what I've done, this is a 3/4 inch piece of MDF, which is 3 foot by 7 foot. And then I took the excess, cut it into 3-inch strips, and then glued and screwed it to the bottom edge all the way around to make a drop edge. So when you're covering the edges, you don't want to see the seam because the seams will show through in the finished epoxy. So you have to seal the edges. You can do one of two things. You can either have a smooth edge, where basically you just take a really thin layer of Bondo, smear it around the edge, and then sand it smooth. The other thing that I've done here, this is called a rock face edge. As you can see, it's got gouges in it. It also has epoxy on the front as well. And so the way you do that is you take a grinder with a 50 grit sanding disc and basically go along, knock the edge down a little bit at different places, but also to make different kinds of gouges and cuts in the sides of the Bondo, or the sides of the MDF. So it gives you more of a textured look. And then I came back with Bondo and basically just using my hand, smeared Bondo over the top of it. What I've got here is, I already showed how I made the rock face edge. This is 3/4 inch MDF, 2 plies. And then I painted it with 2 coats of the stone coat undercoat epoxy paint primer. After I sanded it, or after painting it, I sanded it with 220 grit sandpaper just to smooth it out and also to create a mechanical bond between the undercoat and the epoxy itself. So what I'll be doing today is actually doing a mixture of different techniques that you can do with epoxy. I've got some spray paint here, and you can both mix this in with the epoxy. You can also spray it on top and do some fracturing with powder mixed in isopropyl alcohol. I've got a couple bottles of that here. This is black metallic. It's basically 2 teaspoons of the metallic powder mixed in 8 ounces of 91% isopropyl alcohol. And I'll show you how I use that later. So I've got my stone coat countertop epoxy, which is mixed to 1-to-1 ratio based on volume. I've got some epoxy dyes, black and white. Then I've got some different mica powders. This is a Giza blue. This is copper metallic, bronze, and turquoise. So basically what I'll be doing is there's different ways you can do this. You can mix up 1 or 2 different colors in different ratios, and you can pour them out, trowel them on, chop them, and torch them. I'm going to be doing some different color techniques to make this a little more interesting. Since this is just going in my epoxy workshop, I just thought I'd play around and have some fun with it and see what kind of cool stuff I can come up with. The first thing I'm going to do is take some of this spray paint and do some undertones. So even when you're doing the different color techniques with the epoxy, sometimes you'll be able to see through it and to see the undertones. So by doing a little bit of different coloring, you can create some really cool effects. So basically what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to use kind of some blues and some mixtures of that, and then I'm going to do like a big stripe kind of going diagonally here with some copper, and then I'll also use the copper mica powder in the epoxy. So what I'm going to do is basically just kind of outline where I want to do it. It's also important too, because when the epoxy rolls over the edges, it's going to be a little bit thinner, so you can kind of hit your edges a little bit. And that'll kind of give it some neat looking undertones. bit brighter. So just doing some areas in between where the other stuff was. This is Bright Coat Copper. And I typically use Rust-Oleum brand paints, spray paints, because they work really well with epoxy. So I'm just going to kind of a little bit of this and outline where I want that. The paint's dry a little bit, and then the other thing I've done is I've put some painter's tape. I've got two rows of that all the way around the edge. The reason I'm doing that is because I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be pouring about 5 ounces per square foot, and I'm doing some different color effects and techniques on top. And so I want to make sure it all stays in here and not start rolling over the edges. So that way I can control what I'm doing, and then after the epoxy starts to set up in about an hour or so, then I'll pull the tape and then let it roll over the edges and fix it. So I've got 96 ounces of epoxy mixed up right here. I'm going to mix this for about 2 minutes. So I'm just going to let this drip off to the side over here. So I've got my different additives. This is my copper right here. So that's going to be my main base color for the stripe area in the middle. Sticks. So I'm just going to mix this by hand. Make sure I get all the powder off the bottom. So this is just additional mixing on the epoxy too. Look how pretty that is. That copper. Love that stuff. One of my favorite colors. I'll pour a little bit in each one of these. Normally you want a good rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon per quart. I've got a little bit more than a quart. I want this pretty dark, so I'm going to put it in extra. And I'm just going to mix this in with a stick. too by using the stick. I can make sure I get my edges really good. Anything, any unmixed epoxy that can stuck to the edge of the bucket, I can get that mixed in. I'm not necessarily going to just pour it where it mixes the whole thing, but I'm going to kind of create a little line here. On this side, start pulling this a little bit. Stuff's already starting because it wants the stuff level, and this table is level. Actually, on the four corners, there's little posts that I can raise up and down to make this thing perfectly level using a laser level. Because you want your surface when you're doing your epoxy as level as you can possibly get. Drip some of that up through here, and kind of what I'm trying to keep in mind is that, you know, this is kind of a sedimentary pattern, so I'm kind of keeping everything running this way. Line, I'll put just a little turquoise line right down between the two. So now what I'm going to do is kind of fill in these empty spots, and I don't really want to mix all the colors together, so I'm just going to kind of move the epoxy over to the edges. And just meld them together a little bit. You can already start to see where it's all the different colors are kind of melding together, and they're starting to create patterns in here. So that's going to pop the bubbles. You can do it with a heat gun, or this is a propane torch. This is my favorite thing because you don't have to worry about a cord. So I could just leave it right there. And this is done. This would be pretty cool, you know. It's neat looking, but no, that's no fun. Let's do some fun stuff. What we're gonna do, we're gonna make some veins. Do some little pattern veins here. A little blue, a little white. We'll do like some fracture veins here, patterns. The other thing I like to do is take a stick and basically just play with it a little bit and feather it out. Take some of this and just meld that copper into that a little bit. That'll look cool. I put some white and some black, and then I sprayed some seaside on top of that, and then that's just some clear with some seaside. And you can see that it makes a kind of a different thing. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take some blue metallic spray. Oh shit. basically I took all the tape off and then basically just used my hand, went around and make sure, basically breaking the surface tension and making sure the epoxy rolled over the edge. So now what's going to happen though is over the next couple of hours, this is going to spread out just a little bit. It's going to level itself, and so the edges it'll run around the edges, and it'll make little drips underneath the bottom. And so you could either just leave it alone at this point and come back, and after you're, so the next step is after this dries for 24 hours, then I'll take some 220 grit sandpaper, lightly sand the top, and then I'll do a flood coat, which is basically just clear epoxy without any additives in it. And what that'll do is that'll seal everything, because I've got dyes and powders and spray paint and stuff, and some of that's on the surface. So if you don't seal it, then if you start using a table, some of those things, those effects can rub off, and you'll lose your effects. So you put a clear coat on there, and then after that, you can either leave a clear coat depending on what you're doing. If it's some kind of table, then you can do a seal coat, like an ultimate top coat. They either have a gloss or a matte finish. So the matte finish makes it look more like natural stone. Gloss just makes it gives it a real tough, just a little extra thick wear layer that protects everything. So basically what I'll do at this point is about every 30 minutes I'll come down here, walk around, scrape all the drips off the bottom, because I don't want to sand them. So it's easier just to scrape them off until they stop dripping. So the table's dry now after the color coat, and you can see all these different techniques. So you got spray paint with isopropyl alcohol, which causes a selling effect here. See, here's another example of it, where you spray alcohol into spray paint, causes all this fracturing. And so I think it turned out pretty cool. The more you look at these things, the more details you get, where the different types of mica powder and the dyes and spray paint all kind of intermix to form interesting patterns. So what I've done is I've lightly sanded with 220 grit sandpaper, wiped all that off, and then I sprayed the top with 91% isopropyl alcohol to get rid of any remaining sanding debris. And that's all cleaned up now. So now I'm ready for my flood coat. Okay, I've got my clear epoxy mixed up. So this is 64 ounces. And again, the Stone Coat countertop epoxy is a 1-to-1 ratio. So 32 ounces of part A and then 32 ounces of part B. Mix it up for 2 minutes in my mixing bucket. So I'm getting ready to pour this out. One of the things I like to do before I pour it out though, I usually take a stir stick and then just kind of run around the edges, just to make sure that there's no unmixed epoxy that's sticking to those edges. And that way too, because this is the same bucket I used the other day to pour the color coat, and after it dried, I just peeled out the epoxy off the plastic because it won't stick to it. And then I can just reuse the bucket. So I've got my 1/8 by 1/8 square notch trowel. I'm gonna use that to spread the epoxy out since I want a nice even coat on this. And then I've got a brush that I'm gonna use to chop the top of it. And we'll torch it, and that'll be it. So normally when I'm pouring out the clear coat, because there's no additives in this, it's just pure epoxy. Make sure I get one more good little stir here, and then I'm just going to kind of pour that out in the middle in a big pile. And then I'm going to scrape my edges so I don't waste any epoxy. All spread out now, and so what I'm going to do is take this 1/8 inch square notch trowel and basically just going to rake it back and forth real lightly over the surface. Some of this paint stuff, you don't want to scratch it. So I'm basically just going to rake it down. Being sure initially not to rake it over the edge until I get all my middle part covered. Pretty good. I'm going to use the heel of the chop brush and basically chop all this out, which is going to get rid of any lines. And on the way too, I can make sure I get it all the way to the edge. Chopping all this out gets rid of the lines. And again, I'm not in a super big hurry because, like I said, I've got at least an hour to work with this, and this won't take but 5 minutes maybe. I've pretty much got it all chopped out, and then what I basically do is try to get the angle on the light. Make sure you get all of them coated good. First, I'm going to use a propane torch, and we're going to pop all the bubbles. Get this thing to set up really nice and flat. So I'm going to run this over about 1 inch to 2 inches off the surface. Nice creeping pattern.
So basically what I do now is I'll let this set up for a little while, and if I need to, I'll come back and torch it a second time in a few minutes. And then I'm gonna let this dry and it'll be all done. At that point I could put a clear coat or a ultimate top coat on it to give it just another finish, and you can either use the gloss or more of the matte finish. But I kind of like the way this looks being really glossy. So I'll probably just use it, and again, this is just a work table, so it's always going to have plastic over it. Anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video on how you do epoxy countertops or any kind of epoxy project that you want to do. So it's a fun thing, hobby to do, and if you guys are interested, I hope you'll give it a try. If you've got a project that you want to do, I'd be glad to help you with it. Just message me, and I'll help you with a project, or if you want me to do something for you, I'd be happy to do that as well.